Good evening, everyone. I am extremely honored to be here. I want to thank, of course, the county, EDASC, for having me here. It's a little humbling to be asked to come to a local economy like this and go, hey, tell us what's happening here. Because, as an economist, I spend most of my time floating from, 30,000 feet above sea level to 5,000 feet above sea level. And whenever I do get pulled closer to the ground level, you get closer and closer, and you begin to realize what a rich and complicated and wonderful tapestry is below you that you can never see from that 5 to 30,000 square foot. And certainly tonight, my first opportunity to be here, hopefully not the last, we'll see. I just need to start out by saying that, my goal tonight is to tell you about what's happening in the U.S. economy, what's happening in the state of Washington economy, and again, from my vantage point, what's happening right here in Skagit County. So, the idea is to help you better understand what you're seeing at the ground level. And, as time goes on, I'm going to learn more and more about some of that wonderful local, shall we say, tapestry. Now, let's just start with the big picture. What is happening in the nation? Well, you might have heard recession, right? Screaming headlines. Jamie Dimon is an economic hurricane, 98% chance of a global recession, full-blown correction in housing markets, the stock market's in a bear market. It's scary, right? I mean, if you've read the headlines over the last 6 months, a lot of journalists have been discussing this as if it's not even if we're going to have a recession. It's obvious we're going to have a recession. Everybody's saying it. Now, a couple things here to keep in mind. First of all, when you look at this group of forecasters, you got to first acknowledge they have one of the worst track records of any predictor anywhere. I mean, these guys would better not be bookies, I'll tell you that, because they would be out of business really quick. They basically missed the last 3 recessions 100%, and they've called all sorts of recessions that were never going to happen. So, on its face, this shouldn't really concern you by any stretch of the imagination. It really shouldn't. And to be clear, you look at this cast of characters, these were the same folks who a couple of years ago told us that the pandemic was going to cause a depression. It didn't. And of course, in 2019, they told us we were going to have a recession. That time, it was because of the Chinese trade war and some issues in real estate. And by the way, the same group of people who, over the last real decade, have continued to tell us over and over how terrible and tragic and traumatic everything that happens in the United States has been. Now, I have been a little bit on the other side of the fence. The big call I made back in 2006 was actually calling the Great Recession. And since then, I've been more on the optimistic side of things. What I've seen over the last decade is better and better numbers in all sorts of different ways, showing a U.S. economy that's been moving forward in a lot of very positive ways. But I got to tell you that for me, over the last decade, it's been odd, because I look at the data and I go, hey, this looks pretty good. And then I pick up the headline, and it's not good. Now, this dichotomy, this weirdness has been a problem for me. I have a PhD in economics. I got it from UCLA, which they called Chicago West. And in our world, people are rational. I know, that's silly, isn't it? But, work with me. They're rational. And what that means is they internalize information, and they respond accordingly. But what I saw over the last decade was the data doing this and the attitude doing this. And I couldn't figure that out. For a long time, I called it miserabilism, right? It's miserabilism that is affecting this national mood. But well, not too long ago, I read a book by Robert Shiller. He famously wrote Irrational Exuberance like 25 years ago about the dot-com nonsense. He wrote a recent book called Narrative Economics. And for me, it was definitely an epiphany. Because what he said in this book was he said this idea that the narrative follows the data is silly. Chicago, in their obsession with mathematics, has just basically tossed the story, the narrative, completely out. Hey, it's all about the data. We don't have to think about that stuff. And Shiller points out quite rightly that just a cursory look at the conversations around us, and you have to immediately recognize that the stories we tell each other are different than what the data is saying. And you have to throw this idea that they're going to be correlated out completely. And he goes on the next step. He points out that it's not just a recent phenomenon. This has gone on for a very long time. In fact, look, when the narrative and the reality, when the stories we're telling each other match what's actually going on out there, things are good. The government's going to pursue good policies. Households are going to make good in spending and saving decisions. Businesses will make good business decisions. But when the narrative becomes disengaged, well, watch out, because weird things are going to happen. And, you know, it's not just this last cycle of miserableism. Let's go back prior to the Great Recession. Does anybody remember in 1998, if you had a business plan that was never going to make a penny and you slapped .com on it, suddenly it's worth $1 billion? And that was a broken narrative. Or, of course, in 2005 and 6, when Wall Street somehow or other convinced us that you could take a bunch of subprime mortgage debt, slap it together in some asset-backed security, and sell 80% of it off as this wonderful AAA gold-plated safe debt, right? Again, broken narrative created some really big problems for the economy. So it's been, if you will, an epiphany in as much as I started to realize that to be a good forecast, you can't just look at the numbers. You have to have a broader vision of the stories we tell each other, because the two of those together will give you a sense of what's going on. Now, where does this sort of lead us for 2023, where the economy's heading? Well, again, the narrative is obvious. A recession is nigh. Why is there going to be a recession? Well, you first have to start out with the basic idea that the economy is already in a crisis. Now, what kind of crisis? I don't know. I guess it depends on what party you belong to, right? You know, it's either rules or inequality, or it's taxes or global warming or this or that. Everybody has some reason why the economy is already in a massive crisis. And then you slap on, of course, the two big stories of 2022, which is a big surge in inflation, and of course, the big rise in interest rates, when supposedly these are crushing real estate, crushing consumers, and therefore we're going to have a recession. No, not really. First of all, let's take on the two big things that happened over 2022, inflation and rising interest rates. These aren't exogenous shocks that just kind of landed on us like some meteor from outer space. Rather, high inflation and higher interest rates are the direct consequence of our overreaction to the pandemic. We vastly overstimulated the economy, and what we're seeing right now is the direct consequences of that excessive stimulation, no more, no less. As for a recession coming upon our shores, look, I'm a real world guy. If I'm going to predict a recession, I'm not going to look at the stock market. That is an extremely flawed vision of what's happening in the U.S. economy. I have to look at the ground level. And to predict a recession, what you have to see is some large change in the underlying structure of demand, typically, but not always, driven by some big imbalance. Well, I don't see any imbalances. I don't see any reason in the world why we should see some sort of recession. I'm going to put security, take this man out of the room, take that, no, I'm just kidding. Listen, I am going to have a lot of slides, way too many. At the end of this thing, there will be a QR code. And you can click on that QR code to get a copy of the presentation. I meant to mention that at the beginning, I totally forgot. So there's no imbalances. Why will we have a recession? As for what's going to happen this year, there's little doubt that interest rate sensitive sectors like real estate going to take a little time to absorb the new rates. On the other hand, I anticipate that good consumer spending and business investment will more than offset the weakness we're going to see in real estate and finance. So for me, there's nothing really to talk about, at least from a cyclical perspective. Now, does that mean everything's fine? And the answer is absolutely not. I do see problems in the economy, but the problems I'm looking at are not the problems that are in this collective narrative. For example, I'm really worried about housing shortages. We have not been building enough housing anywhere in the United States, and that problem is going to become a lot worse because of the collapse in filtering driven by the big spike in interest rates. We have labor shortages, again, everywhere in the United States, and we really got to figure this out because this is not going away. It's not going away. We, of course, are going to have public deficit problems at the federal and many state levels as they deal with the consequences of the last couple of years. But for me, the scariest thing of all remains the gap between the narrative and the reality. Because, again, if the stories remain off base from reality, it's going to be a tough time to expect households, government, and businesses to make good decisions. And the biggest thing, if anything, I can do anything tonight, I'm hopefully going to give you a little bit of evidence to show you how off base the narrative is and to give you some sense of what the real story is underneath the surface. All right? So with that, let's jump right into it. Yes, mixed economic signals in 2022. The economy slowed down by the fourth quarter, about 1% year-over-year growth rate. The University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index has plummeted to levels we haven't seen since the Great Recession. That's kind of a worrisome sign, although I don't know about you, this doesn't feel like the Great Recession. And if you're a numerologist, you're going to, of course, talk about the fact that the yield curve has been inverted. The yield curve, by the way, is nothing more than the gap between long-run and short-run interest rates. Long-run interest rates tend to be above short-run interest rates. When they flip, well, most often occurs right before a recession. Now, why this relationship occurs is more correlation than causation, which I can get into at some deeper time, but this doesn't convince me at all. And let's be clear, it's pretty certain we're not in a recession right now, okay? This morning, a couple days ago, by the way, unemployment came out, and as noted by the congressman, a 3.4% unemployment rate in the United States, the lowest since 1968. Industrial production has cooled off just a bit, but still near all-time high levels. This is an economy working at full capacity, certainly nothing that looks like a recession. We are going full bore. So where does the story begin? Well, yet again, it goes back to miserableism and the pandemic. Remember some of these headlines? This is the kind of things that popped out when the pandemic hit. Oh, 30 to 40 million people are going to be evicted. 30% of people with home loans are going to stop paying. Home prices are going to collapse. JP Morgan sees an economy contracting by 40%. One of my favorite quotes, one of my former colleagues at UCLA, make no mistake, this has morphed into a depression-like crisis. I wanted to put him in a time machine and send him back to 1931 so badly, you know? This is what a depression really looks like. Now, listen, there's no doubt the pandemic was a tragic circumstance. Millions of people died. We were all stuck at home for a long time. This was not good, but it was never an existential economic threat. What happened to the U.S. economy with the collapse of the subprime bubble was far more serious than the pandemic. The pandemic was a period of time where we just had to wait. And as soon as we waited and we got the vaccines out, we're going to go out and we were going to start spending and living our lives again. It was spending delayed, not spending canceled. It wasn't that big of a deal. But don't let reality intrude on a good narrative. The narrative of the Depression caused one of the most insane outpourings of economic stimulus this nation has ever seen. $6.5 trillion in fiscal stimulus was put into this economy in 2 years. Now let me put that in context. If you look at what happened over the course of the pandemic, the U.S. economy lost about $1.15 trillion in economic output. And for that, we got $6.5 trillion of stimulus. That's a 6-to-1 replacement rate. That's not what Keynes was talking about, okay? He's spinning in his grave, all right? This was an incredible outpouring of money. And one of the big questions was, well, where do you get all that cash? Because prior to the pandemic, the federal budget was running a little less than $1 trillion deficit. You can't just walk to the bond markets and go, yeah, I need $3.5 trillion now. You would have flipped the bond markets. You would cause chaos. You can't do that. What do? Call Jerome Powell, head of the Federal Reserve. And he leaped into the foray. $5 trillion of quantitative easing. Again, definition, a quantitative easing is when the Federal Reserve buys government debt. So in other words, of the $6.5 trillion of stimulus, $5 trillion of it was funded just by the good old printing press. Now, this is not the first time we use quantitative easing as a tool. Ben Bernanke did it back in the day. He did $3.5 trillion of quantitative easing over about 6 years, which, you got the Nobel Prize not too long ago. So maybe that's what Jerome was aiming for. I don't know. But to be clear, what Ben Bernanke did and what Jerome Powell did were completely different. Look, what does cause a depression? What actually causes a depression? It's not a pandemic. It's deflation. It's a bad recession combined with deflation. This is understood knowledge. And this is exactly what Ben Bernanke had to contend with. When the subprime bubble popped, we had a huge reduction in aggregate demand because households were up to their eyeballs in debt and the housing market fell apart, and there were these real shocks. But the scary part was the collapse we were seeing in our financial system, the banks that were closing down, the investment banks that were closing down, the seizing up of the debt markets. This is deflationary, and this is a real problem. So what Ben Bernanke did was leap to the forefront, did $3.5 trillion of quantitative easing to offset the deflationary effects of the collapse of that particular bubble. And he did a hell of a job. Now the problem here with Mr. Powell's decision is there was no financial crisis. There was no big spiking in debt delinquencies. There were no failing banks. There was not a financial crisis. There was no deflationary pressures at all. And the impact is obvious. The top line there is 3-year growth rates in M2, the broad metric of money supply. You can see the big growth rates when we had the high inflation 70s. It cooled off for a while. Take a look at the middle part of the first decade of this century, and you can see Ben Bernanke's $3.5 trillion kept money supply growth nice and steady. Not too hot, not too cold, kept it right here. Powell's quantitative easing created a 50% increase in prices in money supply in 3 years, the greatest increase in money supply we've seen since we came off the Bretton Woods system in 1969. So, yeah, you threw a lot of money at the economy. What happens next? Well, yet again, this is established knowledge. It's not a mystery. Economics started on the study of currencies and their impact on economies. There's this guy named Milton Friedman, who wrote a book, wrote tons of books, but one of the easiest ones called Money Mischief, written in like 1982. It's a couple hundred pages. You buy it on Amazon for $14. I learned more about central banking and money supply from this book than I ever did from my graduate level textbook. It's a brilliant book, and apparently no one in the Federal Reserve has read it. Because if they had, you know exactly what's going to happen. You throw $5 trillion in new cash at the economy. $5 trillion in new cash at the economy, and the first thing that happens is money illusion kicks in. Everybody feels rich. There's money everywhere, and that feeling of richness causes the economy to take off. Interest rates go down, asset prices go up, consumer spending takes off, businesses start to invest. It feels great. Kind of like you feel great after half a bottle of tequila. Because it's a false sense of wealth. It's not real. Real wealth is driven by the capacity for our nation to produce stuff, goods and services. And that's a function of your labor supply and their training and infrastructure and institutions and machines and computers. This is what actually creates greater ability to produce goods and services. You throw a bunch of money at the economy, you're increasing demand beyond the capacity for the economy to actually produce it. What's the equilibrating factor? Prices. Inflation starts to kick in, the hangover. Suddenly, inflation takes off, interest rates start to go up, asset prices go down, consumer spending cools off, and ultimately, in the long run, inflation has long-run negative consequences. It creates sharp transfers of wealth from savers over to borrowers, and of course, overall investment risk rises. So you're left worse off in the long run if you have this big inflationary spell. This is the whole concept of having an independent Federal Reserve to make independent decisions, because it's not a good thing to toss $5 trillion to expand the money supply by 50% in short order, but that's exactly what we did. Now, by the way, when you start thinking about the last 2 years, that's it in a nutshell. I mean, the last 2 years is the half a bottle of tequila and the hangover. That's it, right? And when you think about, for example, some of these supply chain problems you saw out there, we heard lots of reasons for supply chain problems except for the real one. The real reason we had supply chain problems was our economy was never designed, was never built for the major surge in consumer demand we saw. Huge increase in imports that we weren't prepared for. Now, the good news here is things are starting to clear up. Whether you're looking at the Global Supply Chain Pressure Index or even, for example, Washington State trade and goods, both imports and exports, have started to take off after the big shrinking. In fact, it's interesting. If you take a look at the port up here north of you between Canada and Washington State, take a look at those numbers over the last couple of years. A huge surge in stuff going back across the border, in large part because the ports down in my neck of the woods aren't doing a very good job keeping up. So you see a lot of course, trade wheeling around to different sorts of paths, and you happen to be right in the middle of one of the big expansions on this path, having to do, of course, with that port over to Vancouver, Canada. Now, with all this, of course, you also got the big surge in inflation, and not just here in the United States. The whole world saw it, mainly because most of the central banks in the world overdid it. They printed too much money in response to the pandemic, and boom, inflation started to pick up. It peaked at about, well, the PCE at about 7%. It's starting to cool off. You probably saw the number the other day. Year over year CPI is about 6.2 right now. So we're moving in the right direction. For me, none of this is mysterious. This is completely obvious. For me, the mysterious part is the conversations we're hearing about inflation. I mean, when you turn on the news and they start talking about inflation, what do you hear some of our policy leaders say? Oh, it's caused by supply chain issues. Oh, it's the federal deficit, greedy corporations, not enough manufacturing jobs, Biden's bad green energy policies. Now both parties can agree, it's Putin's fault. Yeah, right? But stop. No. No. It's not how it works. I mean, what next? Saturn isn't aligned with Jupiter. Kim shouldn't have dumped Kanye. It's the Seahawks' horrible front line. I mean, what do you come, really? This is all just as reasonable. Inflation is a monetary phenomenon. Always. But you see, you can't say this now. Remember miserableism? In the miserablest world, 80% of Americans are living hand to mouth. They're one paycheck away from being homeless. You can't stand up in that world and say, yeah, we have inflation because people are trying to spend too much money. You're not allowed to say that. But that is what's actually going on. Now, you know, one of the places that makes me absolutely the most crazy, do you remember the big surge in gas prices we had in the beginning of 2022? Right? And the existential crises, the hand-wringing and pearl-clutching, right? I've never seen so much drama over this. And I get it. It was a pretty sharp increase, a 50% increase in gasoline prices in about 4 months. Wow. But, you know, was it really supply? Was it really Russia? You know, look on the left-hand side here. Take a look at gas prices. That's the black line. The orange line is vehicle miles driven. You saw gas prices go up by 50%. Vehicle miles driven didn't change. People just kept driving. Well, that's not supply, that's demand. And of course, they kept buying cars too, right? And you would always see that. This is where I would go crazy. You'd have a TV reporter, right? And he'd walk up to this guy at a gas station. Hey man, how do you feel about filling up your car? Oh, it sucks. This administration's horrible. Can't believe how terrible this is. Oh, okay, thank you very much. Back to you, Becky. You know, whoa, stop. What are you doing? Ask him the next logical question, please, which is, so where are you going, Chief? Well, me and the boys are going to my new expedition down the lake, do a little bass fishing. But I thought you said gas was expensive. It is, we can only afford the cheap beer. What are we doing? Why don't we ask these questions, right? But always. Now, of course, the Federal Reserve has responded to inflation. By the way, not through quantitative tightening. They've barely started the process of quantitative tightening. M2 is just now starting to come down just a little bit. Their primary inflation fight has been by cranking up the federal funds rate, which is odd because it's not how we got inflation. It's a completely different tool, right? But nevertheless, that's what they're trying to do. And yes, with that in mind, you know, they're cooling things off. They're cooling demand off a little bit. They're taking a little bit of money out. We're over peak inflation, but we got a little ways to go. I'm thinking probably 8 to 11% over the next 2.5 years or so. So not as hot as it's been, but hotter than the markets are thinking. But you know, the worst is behind us. This isn't the 1970s where they overdid it every single year. It was kind of a one-time thing. It was an impulse that'll fade out of the system. But of course, federal funds rate up, inflation up, interest rates are up. The mortgage rate, I guess, is running at about 6.5% again. 10-year bonds are running around 4%. Yeah, okay, suddenly interest is expensive and asset markets are kind of subsiding, right? The stock market is down. How much is it down? I don't know, 25%, 15%, 35%, depends on what hour of the day it is, right? It's insanely volatile. But it had to come down. And for all the people who complain to me about the stock market portfolio, oh man, I lost 25% over the last year. I go, well, how are you doing from 3 years ago? Oh, pretty good. Exactly. You know, exactly. They went up to a crazy level and now they're just subsiding to something resembling realistic. Billion-dollar tech funding rounds are becoming rare again because venture capital cooled off quite a bit. But, you know, 2022 was the second best year for venture capital ever. It just was a pale comparison to what happened in 21. It was 21 that was weird, not 22. I mean, there was not a doubling of good ideas from 2020 to 2021. There just wasn't, okay? So, of course, and even this stuff, right? Bitcoin, right? I mean, geez, really? Bitcoin was $60,000 at one point. I don't know, was it 17,000, 18,000 now? By the way, fundamental value of Bitcoin, zero, okay? We got any crypto people in the room? Anyone? No, no one's rolling. I always get a few people raising their hand. No? No? All right. Well, listen, for anybody in the room, Ponzi, Italian guy, lived about 100 years ago. Look him up. Every generation goes through this. My generation had Beanie Babies. Just saying. Good news is venture capital in Washington did come down, but not by much. Actually a pretty good year, and we still see money coming in here. This is interesting. We actually got some data on venture capital coming into Skagit County, and lo and behold, good couple of years, actually better in 22 than 21. Yet again, you can see, what's interesting is venture capital is leaving its home base in San Jose and Seattle, and looking afield, because they're looking for different kind of opportunities. And in a lot of ways, it's not about being a tech center anymore. It's how do you take tech and apply it to your local economy? And so you see these venture capital guys vending out some interesting stuff here. What about real growth trends over the last year? What happened in 2022? It really wasn't that bad of a year. For all the chaos, we grew about 2%. Consumers added about almost all that growth, about 1.9%. Goods were flat, services were up pretty strongly. We saw a cooling off of spending on structures and residential, not surprising, given the big increase in interest rates. But spending on equipment and intellectual property was actually good. Exports actually picked up quite a bit over the course of the last year. Some good data, some good numbers, it's kind of a mixed bag, not just big declining thing. Now, if you really want to talk about where the economy is going, you have to start with the consumer. If you don't start with the consumer, you're missing it, because the consumer is almost 70% of GDP. If the consumer's healthy, they can push us through a lot of rough waters. If they're not healthy, we have a problem on our hand. And of course, as good as consumers were over the course of the year, we did have those 2 months of negative growth in the last 2 years. Now, by the way, this punchline doesn't work, because I don't know if you read the paper this morning, it was up 3% in January. So it's already bouncing back. But this is a graph I pulled right out of the Wall Street Journal to give you a sense of the ridiculous context that we get out of papers, right? Because that looks pretty scary, right? Now, let me show it to you in a slightly different way, okay? You see those big negative growth rates? That's that teeny tiny little downturn at the very end there, okay? And the only thing that teeny tiny little downturn thing tells me is that our garages are getting too full, okay? It's not... Obviously, after a huge surge, spending right here in the county, this is taxable sales in Q2, up pretty steadily. You look at 6-year growth rate, a good steady numbers across the board. Some of this, of course, is a shift back to spending on services. We're not necessarily buying all these goods anymore. We can go back to traveling and everything else. Retail spending on restaurants is way up, whereas groceries is cooling off a bit. Take a look at Clark County gaming revenues. This is one of everybody says, what's one of your better indicators for consumers? I like looking at gaming revenues in Vegas, okay? Right now, gaming revenues have never been higher in Las Vegas, despite the fact that the conference business is not fully back and the Chinese whales aren't showing up. This tells you how much Americans are not suffering, or maybe they are suffering. The dealer keeps getting blackjack, whatever, right? Americans are traveling abroad, but more so than foreigners are coming back to the United States to go traveling. Nevertheless, hotel RevPAR data is looking pretty good. You can see the Seattle numbers there up very strongly, good numbers there. And there's still pent-up consumer demand. The whole thing about autos I just started to talk about. Total vehicle sales were pretty weak in 2022, only about 14 million. Contrast that to almost 18 million in 2019. But to be clear, the reason it's low is not because people don't want to buy cars. It's because there's no cars to buy. Take a look at the inventories on the right-hand side there. In 2017, there was almost 1.2 million cars for sale in the United States. Today, there's like 110,000. There's just nothing to buy. This is the issue. We're still trying to catch up with demand from last year, much less worrying about demand for this year. Can consumers survive the big surge in inflation? Well, again, context, please. We had 1 year of relatively high inflation, 1 year, after 4 years of low inflation. Over 5 years, our inflation rate was about 17%, which is just a hair above where we were in 2007. So yeah, no, this isn't that big of a deal. If you want to see real inflation, go back to 1979, where after 5 years, it was 50%. That's a true inflationary spell. As for the rise in interest rates, most American debt is wrapped up in this wonderful financial product called the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. They're not influenced by it at all. Financial obligation ratios are still near an all-time low level. Those who think consumers are going to dry up are going to tell you that it's because incomes are getting hurt. Look, people are dipping into their savings. Their 2% savings rate. Real disposable incomes are where they were in 2020. Consumers can't keep it up. But this isn't about income, it's about wealth. Remember, the beginning of this thing, all that money thrown at the financial markets caused wealth levels to go up. At one point in time, by $30 trillion. It's cooled off. Now Americans are only up 14 trillion from where they were pre-pandemic. But even there, it's not a real figure because most of that money is in equities, and equities don't have a big wealth effect. They're in your 401k or they're owned by Jeff Bezos. It's not a big sort of say here and now. There's a number I like. This is checkable deposits. This is cash on hand. This is what Americans have under the mattress in their savings account, wherever they happen to keep it. Prior to the pandemic, all Americans were holding on to about $1 trillion liquid cash. Right now, $5 trillion liquid cash. There's more money floating around there than we've ever seen before. People don't know what to do with it. Now, it's easy to say, well, that's nice for the top 1%. It's not the top 1%. In fact, if you break it down, it turns out even the bottom 50%, their overall cash on hand is up about 300% from where it was pre-pandemic. So there's lots of cash out there supporting consumers, supporting consumer spending. The consumer is going to be just fine. They're going to be just fine. As for here locally, you think about GDP, well, I've been up here a few times to give talks, and it's hard to give a talk to Washington State because everything is going right here. You've been the fastest growing state in about 15 different categories over the course of the last decade. Incomes are up, economic output is great. The economy is just doing wonderful up here. Aircraft manufacturing obviously took a big hit, but that's starting to come back with travel. That's starting to move again. Tech, of course, the big narrative right now is that tech is getting absolutely crushed and all these layoffs are occurring. I don't know why this thing's fading in and out of me. Should I switch to the other one? Where are my AV people?
Mostly okay.
It's mostly okay? Don't worry about it. I'll keep going. All right. That was his way of saying, are you going to finish soon? Anyway. Tick narrative, of course, all sorts of scary things. For all those scary headlines, you know what the unemployment rate in San Jose is right now? 2%. Do you know what happened to initial claims for unemployment insurance? They've gone down. The unemployment rate in the tech industry is 2.4%. Tech's fine, people. Remember, they were overheated, now they're getting back to a normal level, and every one of those tech workers is simply getting another job almost immediately. Here in Skagit, the numbers are not quite as good. In fact, they've been flat in terms of real output over the course of the last few years, but it's a mixed bag. It's interesting. Let me take a look at your professional services, up 34% in real terms over 5 years. Education's up 20%, healthcare up 16%. There's a lot of good positive numbers. The big negatives are, interestingly enough, in transportation, because I would expect this to be a transportation county, given how close you are to the border. That was surprising. But then ag and manufacturing went down quite a bit. Now, I dove into this trying to figure it out, and these numbers are a little odd at the local, for some of the small economies. Here's what I know. Your top ag market, milk, sod, potatoes, doing fine in terms of overall output. Agricultural employment actually picked up over the course of the last couple of years, as did manufacturing employment. So I'm not sure exactly what's going on in the numbers, but I think that these sectors are, to say the least, at least stable, if not succeeding. I'm not sure what's going on in those numbers. That, again, goes down to some of the oddness in that local tapestry. Speaking of businesses overall, again, they're doing fine. Right? They're doing fine. Business profits are up. Non-financial corporate debt to equity is fine. If you take a look at Washington, business applications actually surged in 21 and 22. Good solid numbers there. You see a lot of folks adding new jobs. And here in Skagit County itself, actually we only have 21 data yet, but a big surge in new business formations in 2021. Everything here says people are out. They're starting businesses. Your entrepreneurs are getting new things off the ground. A lot of good news. The issue that businesses have is not weak demand. It's a lack of people. It's a lack of bodies. The job openings rate in the U.S. is still about 6.5%, which is lower than it was 6 months ago, but still vastly higher than it was in 2019. And sectors like healthcare, leisure, hospitality, professional have almost twice the job openings rate as they did just a few years ago. Why? Well, this is basic demographics. One of the things that people don't appreciate is we had a 3.5% unemployment rate before the pandemic, and no, it wasn't the policies of the preceding administration that drove it there. This is basic demographics. We knew this day was coming. It all goes down to the boomers. By the way, it's always the boomers' fault. That's what I've learned, okay? And in this particular case, what the boomers did was they all came out of families of 12 kids, and they all had one kid, which they excessively overparented. Now, of course, basically our population growth, our population pyramid is turned into a population column. And every time a boomer retires right now, you have one Gen Z person coming into the workforce, complaining, whining, and quiet quitting the entire time. Again, this is not rocket science. It's obvious what's happening. It's funny the stories we make up. Now, what made it so immediate was the pandemic, because the pandemic convinced a couple million people to retire. They didn't disappear. They're not afraid to work. They don't have long COVID and all those other ridiculous stories. In the current population survey we do to do the unemployment rate every month, they ask a question. If you're not in the labor force anymore, why? And they give a whole bunch of answers. And 97% of these people said, I retired. There's no mystery here, right? Except for the fact that if we could turn it into bad news, we'll figure out a way to do it. Now, this is a bit of a two-edged sword. One edge is, well, it's great for workers. Take a look at some of these numbers. Look at the enormous increase in overall worker earnings, but particularly for lower skilled workers. People with a high school degree or less are now seeing more earnings growth than people with a bachelor degree or more. Look at the earnings growth graph between the bottom 50% and the top 50% over the last couple of years. Never has that gap been larger. Lower earning workers are actually seeing their earnings growth above inflation. It's the top 50% that are below inflation. We're seeing a complete flip. Income inequality is falling right now. The other side of it, of course, is try to run a business, right? This is the cost of hiring people in construction and logistics and non-supervisory jobs. They're rising 7-8% per year. So yeah, it becomes tougher to run a business. You're not finding enough people. It's funny, the minimum wage debates have gone away, because in most places, the minimum wage isn't even the starting point for most businesses. This is how tight these labor markets are. And you can certainly see the upside of that. If you take a look at some of the areas around here, Skagit County itself, the percent of the population that has a subprime credit score is now dropped below 15%. Median household income is approaching $80,000. Again, this is good data from a local consumer spending standpoint. Good things here. And of course, it also means that businesses are going to continue to invest primarily in labor-saving technologies. And you think about businesses right now, what you have to do is figure out how to do more with less, because it's not going to be easy to get those job openings filled anytime in the near future. And that, by the way, this is good for the West Coast, because the West Coast has tons of companies that specialize in helping businesses do more with fewer people. And so this is all great. And this is why I get upset when they're still putting out headlines about how AI is coming to steal your job. I think we need AI right now, okay? It's kind of obvious, as the case may be. Now, who's ahead, who's behind? You know, you look over the last 10 years or so, and you always have this. You got people who are going to line it up and tell us who's ahead and who's behind and all this kind of stuff. Forget that. Just forget it. It doesn't matter where you are in this country. If you're in the red states or the blue states, if you're in the coastal states, rural, ag area, whatever, the one thing every part of this nation has in common right now is help wanted signs. Everywhere. Everywhere you look, there's a phenomenal increase. Washington is actually interesting, because your job openings right here has only increased by about 1.2 percentage points. Take a look at Alaska, 4 percentage points higher than it was just a couple of years ago. There's nobody over there. Kentucky, Georgia, this and that. Washington's unusual because people are moving here. It's an enormous advantage. And that's when you get to these regional outcomes. Take, for example, you compare California, Oregon, and Washington. You know, what's the difference between these economies? Why has Washington grown faster than California? It's not a story about business climate or picking the right company. It's a story about housing and population growth. Labor force growth in the Pacific Northwest has been substantially faster than the Southwest, and as a result of that, you're having overall growth. Unemployment everywhere is low right now. And of course, if you get a little closer to home, well, that's the same graph we just saw. If you take a look, well, the employment numbers in Washington are about just a little bit past where they were pre-pandemic right now, so relatively good numbers on this front. But you get a little closer, you look down here in the Mount Vernon MSA, that's Skagit County, and you can see that actually overall jobs are lower now than they were a few years ago. And here's the data. Look at the Skagit County. This is payroll employment. You can see it's running about 51,000. Prior to the pandemic, it was 52,000. And the big question is what's going on here? Why aren't these jobs being refilled? Well, the answer, of course, is, again, it's not a function of businesses not wanting people, but not being able to find it. The unemployment in Skagit County right now is well below 6%, close to the lowest it's ever been. The problem is, of course, is labor force has declined. The wave of retirement hit coastal economies harder than most every place else. And of course, what you're facing here is an enormous, of course, labor shortage problem to help fuel overall economic growth in the area. Now, population growth hasn't been that bad. It's actually been picking up, but not growing as fast here as in other parts of the state, as the case may be. And that, of course, is where the problem is. Some folks retired, you don't have enough population growth to replace them, and suddenly you're stuck into this bind. Now, what this means, of course, is that economic development has taken a big turn. It used to be a lot about bringing in jobs, but now you have to focus not so much on jobs, but workers. You got to bring in the people. And, that means we need immigration reform, Congressman, immigration reform. All right, thank you. I'm going to hold you to that, by the way. I'm holding you to that. Desperately, right? But there's other things you can do. You can raise participation rates, right? How do you raise participation rates? Well, you encourage seniors to work. Here's another way of raising participation rates. One of the things I've noticed is the participation rate for women in Europe is a heck of a lot higher than it is here. Now that means there's one of two possibilities. Either American women are lazy. Maybe not. There you go. Or how about the fact that we don't subsidize childcare, right? Now yet again, duh. Now it used to be that this was like, that's a social issue. Not anymore. Now it's a business issue. Because now you help the family, you help the kid, and you help your local business by keeping somebody in the workforce to do their career. By the way, now more than ever, worker training pays off because it's the simpler jobs you can replace with a computer, but not a more complex job. This is the time you take the woman who's cleaning the hotel room and you train her to be a manager behind the counter. Now it works. It didn't work in 2011. Now it does. You have to think about those things. And of course, if you can't do that, well, again, working with small companies, in particular the mom and pop businesses, to help them integrate information technology into what they do so that they too can succeed with yet fewer people. It's a whole new story when it comes to economic development. And of course, one of the biggest stories of economic development is housing and housing supply, which brings me to what's happening in housing. And yet again, pretty scary numbers. I think so. Yeah, this thing's starting to fade on me. I think it's losing its mustard. All right, there we go. What's happening in the housing market? Well, we know there's a big decline in home sales. New home sales are down. I've heard all the scary stories. New single-family homes inventories, single-family homes are up. Single-family housing starts are down. If you look here, big decline, of course, in overall sales in Skagit County. And, of course, home prices are starting to come down as well. And I get all that. But this is not a Great Recession meltdown. This is just sticker shock. You have to keep in mind the enormous increase in prices that occurred over the last couple of years. Just take a look, for example, at, Phoenix. In 2 years, home prices in Phoenix went up 62%. That's insane. Of course, that's not sustainable. But of course, it was driven by all the cash and the frenzy that created. And now the frenzy's fading away, interest rates are up, and that monthly cost is adding up, and yeah, the market's getting really cool. But this is not a market that's due for a big meltdown for a bunch of different reasons. One of the biggest reasons is the financial status of our housing market has never been stronger. Over the last decade, because of some of the changes in the laws regulating mortgages, we've had a very, very modest growth in overall mortgage debt, and the mortgage debt that's out there is incredibly clean. And of course, we had a huge surge in the market that was caused mainly by money, not by debt, by cash, not by debt. And one of the results of that is that equity in our housing market has never been higher. We have $30 trillion in equity in the U.S. housing market right now. $30 trillion, which is 3 times what it was a decade ago. The big problem in housing is supply. In 2007, we had built way too many housing units. But of course, this time around, we didn't build anywhere near enough. And if you're looking at month supply of existing homes, vacant homes for sale, overall housing vacancy rates, particularly in the West, never have housing markets been so tight. Now, why? Well, miserabilism is one reason. Because over the home builders are typically the most optimistic people in the room. And they have taken what happened over the last decade with miserabilism to heart. And you can see how weak overall single family completions were. But there's something else that no one talks about. They're a little uncomfortable about it. But I'm going to tell you about it. On the right-hand side is occupied housing units. And you notice I have like a trend line and what actually happened. Does anybody catch that? And if you look a little closer, I can tell it to you a different way. There was a big decline in people per household. See, here's what happened. We all had to live together for 6 months. And a portion of us realized we didn't like the people we were living with. And they moved out. And there was a secular absorption of about 1.5 million units that took our already bad housing shortage crisis and turned it just like a worker shortage into something really serious and right now. Well, that's the problem. You see, when it comes to housing, this is one of the mistakes. I always hear, oh, we don't have enough affordable housing. That's totally wrong. We don't have enough housing, hence it's not affordable. You see how that works? The affordability part is an equilibrium. Now, why is that important? Well, the other thing that's a big myth is that builders build affordable housing. No, they don't, okay? The vast majority of housing is built at the upper end of the housing market because that's where the margins are actually reasonable. So what do? You build at the top end, that's okay because your upper crust moving to the new place, these guys move here, these guys move here, these guys move here. You build at the top to supply at the bottom. Here's the problem. How many people here refied your house in the last couple of years and have a sub 3% mortgage rate? How many of you are ready to go out and trade that in for a 6.6% mortgage rate? Probably not. So the difference between the housing market of 2009 and 2023 is very obvious. In 2009, the problem was not enough buyers. In 2023, it's not enough sellers. So it is a real problem, and it's going to make housing shortages that much worse. And that is going to be a real problem. And of course, that's also the reason why the rental markets are so incredibly tight right now. You've seen rents go up, vacancy rates go down. Of course, because you can't get into housing because there's nothing available because filtering has absolutely collapsed. And you can certainly see the big increase in rents here. What's interesting is Seattle. Seattle has actually been building lots of multifamily. They really dug in and they got it done. The rest of the state has not. And that has been a big problem in the rest of the states. And you can certainly see it here. If you look at Skagit County, for example, you look at the renters who are housing cost constrained, it's actually up pretty sharply because you haven't been building any multifamily. People are stuck, they can't get into single family. Bam, you have a problem. Now, if you want to grow this county, you got to keep people to move here. And if you want people to move here, particularly younger people, you have to have entry-level housing. Whether that's building true entry-level housing that for ownership, like townhouses, remember those? Or building multifamily apartments, this is what you need to do. And I tell you what, there's a little bit of good news here. Skagit County has actually been built. Look at 2022. Do you see that purple line underneath there? That's multifamily. 2022 saw more multifamily permits going into this county than, well, ever, according to my data here. You know what? You need to do that for 4 years. You need to do that for 4 years. So keep it up. This is the right way to go. So I'm going to wrap up there. I hope I didn't talk too long. Let me go ahead and kind of just summarize. First of all, forget the recession. The expansion is going to continue. Nonsensical. Yes, asset values are going to fall, but it doesn't matter because the underlying asset quality is just fine. Apartment buildings, yeah, okay, cap rates got too low. Prices have to come down, but your rents are going up and your vacancy rates are going to go down. You're going to be fine. Inflation will continue to be hot, but we're over peak inflation. It's going to cool down. Rates should be just about where they are. Right? They're just going to sit here as long as the Fed doesn't do anything weird, which is not a guarantee. Wealth and income will continue to drive consumer spending. Underlying asset quality remains strong. Yes, the economy is a little brittle, but it's less so. As we get through 2023, I think this economy is going to be stronger and stronger, and this nonsense of recession is going to fade. As for potential scenarios, what's the Fed going to do? Obviously, we have the national debt situation, particularly with the debt ceiling issue coming up. We have China, what's going on there. But of course, the biggest issue nationally is this gap between the narrative and the reality. As for Skagit County itself, well, look, it's a small economy, but you're in an incredibly strategic location. You're on a beautiful coast. You're on this incredibly important supply, logistics route going from Canada into the United States. You've got major ports all over the place. There's continued growth in the overall state population. If you look at net migration, people continue to move to the Northwest. They want to live here, and you can be part of that overall population growth, but you have to build housing. You have to build housing. And I get it, that's tough. You know, the local resistance on these issues, I'm from California. I've seen it all, okay? So the key, of course, is to continue the momentum, understand that you can have pristine wildernesses and enough housing. There's plenty of room out here. You can do both. It's finding, of course, that sweet spot in the middle. And then, of course, that's going to help the other big problem, which is this lack of younger workers in the local economy right now. Again, the next generation of people to work in these great new companies you're starting up here, to work in the manufacturing and do all the great things that are going on in this wonderful part of the world. Whew! So, we were running a little late, so I was goosing it a little, even faster than normal. So again, I want to thank you for having me here. I want you to go out, have a successful year. Please, please avoid the weapons of mass distraction, okay? Just forget the screaming headline and the clickbait and all the nonsense that get tossed at you out there. Dig a little deeper and you're going to find out the truth is a little bit more nuanced and often a hell of a lot more positive than what we're telling you. So with all that, I'm going to finish up with my fancy QR code. That's your cue. And again, I want to thank you all very much for your attention tonight. Q&A?